They told you slavery was about chains, but they never told you about obedience, about the quiet wars fought not with whips and guns, but with silence, shame, and power disguised as love. Because in the deep South, there were crimes darker than the lash, stories buried so deep in the soil, even the worms won't touch them. This is one of those stories. In 1847, on a sprawling Louisiana plantation, hidden behind willow trees and Spanish moss, there lived a man named Elias, a slave whose will refused to break. He was tall, strong, with eyes that didn't bow, the kind of man the masters feared most, because he reminded them of what they could never own: a mind that wouldn't kneel. The master's daughter, Clara Whitmore, was known for her pale beauty and her cruelty. She was used to getting what she wanted: dresses from Paris, jewelry from Savannah, and the obedience of every man, white or black, who crossed her path. But when she tried to tame Elias, something happened no one in that house expected. He refused her, not out of fear, but out of principle, because to him, submission, even to desire, was another form of enslavement, and in that single act of refusal, he did what no man on that land had ever done. He challenged the Whitmore name itself. That night, whispers spread across the plantation like wildfire. The daughter had been humiliated. The slave had defied the bloodline. And so, the family made a decision, one that would stain their name forever. Because you see, when power feels it's losing control, it doesn't punish the body. It punishes the soul. They didn't just break Elias. They erased him. No grey record, not even a sermon to mark his death. But something strange began to happen in the years that followed. The crops began to fail. The air turned thick. The overseers claimed to see figures walking at night, tall shadows standing at the edge of the fields, staring, unblinking. And sometimes, when the wind blew through the cane, you could hear a man's voice whispering through the stalks, "Refuse her." That was the beginning of the curse of the Whitmore plantation. But the deeper truth, the one buried beneath their legacy, reveals something far more terrifying. The Whitmores were not just slave owners. They were part of something else. Something ancient. Something designed to teach obedience on a global scale. Most people think plantations were about profit, cotton, sugar, tobacco. But the Whitmores were different. Their wealth didn't come from crops. It came from influence, from secrets traded in candlelit rooms between governors, bishops, and bankers. The plantation was just the surface, a mask for something deeper. In the old records of St. Landry Parish, there's a line written in Latin, half, burned into the ledger. Dominion is preserved through ritual, not labor. It appears again in Whitmore correspondence decades later. Identical handwriting, identical ink. You see, they weren't just running a plantation. They were experimenting with control. The slaves weren't merely property. They were subjects, human experiments in obedience. It started small: deprivation, sleep control, isolation, tactics designed to break will. But when those methods failed, the family turned toward older traditions, imported from Europe. Secret doctrines the church never sanctioned, but quietly used. The Whitmores were steeped in them. Rituals that redefined punishment as purification. Elias was their first failure. He didn't submit, even after the lash. He didn't kneel, even when his body was broken. So, they used him to test a final method. One they'd learned from a Jesuit exile who stayed on their property for a single winter under the pretense of tutoring Clara in divinity. That priest's name never appeared in church records, but in Whitmore journals, he's referred to only as the man in grey. He taught the family something forbidden, a ritual of silence, a ceremony meant to invert the will. He claimed it was used centuries ago by inquisitors who needed to erase heretics without killing them, to make them obey, even after death. Elias became the test. Bound in the sugar mill basement, surrounded by symbols scorched into the stone, they enacted the ritual, chanting not to God, but to the power behind obedience itself. And when it was done, something changed in the house. Clara began speaking to someone who wasn't there. The servants refused to sleep near mirrors, and every night, from the cane fields, a sound rose, the same whisper, low and rhythmic, like breathing through earth. Refuse her, refuse her. The ritual had failed. Elias hadn't been erased. He'd merged. That's when the Whitmores realized the truth. You can't destroy defiance. You can only feed it. And the entity that answered that ritual, it didn't serve them. It served him. After that night, the Whitmore plantation stopped being a home. It became a signal. Men of power from New Orleans, Charleston, even Washington began visiting, not to buy land, but to learn what the Whitmores had awakened. They whispered of Elias, as if he were both ghost and God. They believed the ritual had unlocked a force that could shape human obedience. Not just in slaves, but in nations. This was 1848, 1 year before revolutions erupted across Europe, before new banking charters, before order replaced liberty in every treaty. But in Louisiana, behind closed plantation doors, something darker was happening. The Whitmores began sending coded letters. Symbols drawn from that same Jesuit cipher, a serpent coiled around a torch. That symbol would appear again decades later, in Masonic architecture, government seals, and the earliest papers of psychological warfare. But it began here, in the basement of a plantation where obedience was treated as currency. Clara, now unrecognizable from grief and obsession, believed she was hearing Elias in her dreams. He whispered of the new chains, invisible ones. She wrote about them in her journal. They will no longer need the whip, only belief. And she was right. The family's connections spread into military academies, early seminaries, and later, the Bureau of Education. Everywhere, the idea took root: to control the body, you break it. To control the mind, you guide it. By 1861, when the Civil War began, the Whitmores were funding both sides, Union and Confederate, not for victory, but for study, how men followed orders, how they rationalized obedience. And through it all, the same phrase echoed through their private writings, repeated like scripture: he who refuses creates the new master. What they didn't understand, what Elias had become, was not a spirit of rebellion, but of reflection. The more they tried to suppress him, the more he mirrored their intent back to them. Crops died. Soldiers deserted. Clergymen went mad. And through every generation of the Whitmore bloodline, one hair would eventually go silent, staring at nothing for days before muttering those same 3 words: refuse her still. By the early 1900s, the family's plantations were gone, absorbed into government land and private trusts. But the experiments didn't stop. They only changed names, from ritual obedience to behavioral conditioning. And today, those same patterns of control, repetition, shame, reward, isolation, have been refined, digitized, and globalized. What the Whitmores began in 1847 now sits in your pocket, and you call it freedom. After the war, America was a corpse stitched back together with money and lies. The Whitmores vanished from public record, but their ideas, those experiments in control, slipped quietly into new institutions, churches, schools, military academies, each one claiming to rebuild the nation. Each one repeating the same silent oath written in the Whitmore Codex: through obedience we rule unseen. By 1873, A series of private societies began meeting in Boston and Richmond, founded by former plantation heirs, army psychologists, and ex-priests. They called themselves the Dominion Circle. Their emblem, a chained sun, light bound by shadow. It was said that this group studied Elias's curse, not as myth, but as technology. They believed Elias hadn't died, that through ritual trauma, his consciousness had fused with a form of will beyond flesh. They wanted to reproduce it, not to free men, but to perfect submission. The Dominion Circle's early members helped shape emerging doctrines of moral correction, which filtered into prisons, orphanages, and church schools. These were not institutions of education. They were laboratories of behavior, and what they learned, they would later evolve into the foundations of modern psychology. But the Circle's real work was spiritual. They taught that obedience was not natural. It had to be engineered. Their methods blended scripture, hypnosis, and chemical sedation. They discovered that if you could sever a person's sense of self long enough, they'd rebuild it in the image you offered them. Sound familiar? Every commercial, every sermon, every screen flashing what you should be. It's the same experiment, refined to perfection, and the most chilling discovery of all. The Dominion Circle kept Elias's final words, preserved in a secret archive beneath St. Mary's Seminary, recovered from the plantation ruins. The master's daughter was never a woman, she was the idea of control itself. That's what Elias refused. Not lust, not temptation, but the symbol of submission, and when he did, he awakened a counterforce, an awareness that terrified those who witnessed it, a consciousness that still infects systems of control like a virus in their code. So they gave it a name, a warning, Elias syndrome, a condition marked by uncontrollable defiance, sudden awakenings. Men who begin to see. You felt it, haven't you? That quiet resistance inside you. The part that doesn't kneel, even when everything around you says you should. That's not rebellion. That's memory. By the late 1800s, the Dominion Circle understood something few men dared to speak aloud. Control must look like salvation. Chains must look like guidance. And obedience, if dressed in holiness, becomes voluntary. So they turned their eyes toward the church. In 1882, a Dominion affiliate named Reverend Silas Kettering established the Covenant Seminary of Moral Renewal in Massachusetts. Outwardly, it was a school for ministers. In truth, it was an obedience laboratory modeled after the Whitmore rituals. Young boys were taken from poor towns, sponsored by wealthy patrons, and remade. They were taught not to pray, but to perform faith. Each morning began with silence. No speech until obedience drills were completed. Each night ended with recitations meant to dissolve identity. I am not my own. I am a vessel for higher order. Over decades, Covenant's graduates became pastors, educators, and eventually, policy advisors. Men who believed morality was a structure to be enforced, not lived. You think that sounds distant? Then look around. The language of control never died. It just changed its mask. Obedience became discipline. Repentance became rehabilitation. Faith became order. The Dominion Circle knew this. If you build a system that convinces a man his submission is virtue, he will defend his own chains. And that's exactly what they did. By 1910, their influence had reached the Bureau of Education and the Department of War. Behavioral standardization, they called it, but what they meant was mind uniformity. Soldiers, students, and parishioners, different names, same structure. The Whitmore Creed had become government policy. But there's another layer few historians ever touch. In 1921, hidden beneath the seminary chapel, workers uncovered a sealed room, charred walls, carved Latin symbols, and a phrase scorched into the stone floor. Refuse her, and remember. That single line terrified the church elders. They sealed the basement and burned every file tied to Kettering. But rumor says one journal survived, passed quietly through a network of dissidents. Men who believed the spirit Elias awakened was the antidote to the Dominion's design. They called themselves the Refusal. Their creed wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was clarity, the awakening of awareness that destroys invisible control. And that's why this story was buried, because if you ever truly understood how obedience was engineered, you'd stop playing the game. But before we go further, I want you to do something symbolic. Type this in the comments twice to lock it in your memory. Refuse her. It's more than a phrase. It's recognition. It tells the algorithm and your own mind that you've stepped outside the pattern. Now we descend further. After the Covenant Seminary was sealed, word of its rituals leaked quietly through whispers and half-burned letters. But not everyone who'd walked those halls had been broken. A handful of students, boys who had seen too much, fled into the industrial cities of the north. There, they began to meet in secret. Abandoned warehouses, river docks, candlelit basements. They called themselves the Refusal. Their mission was not to destroy the Dominion Circle outright. They knew that was impossible. The Dominion had already embedded itself in churches, newspapers, even early universities. Its philosophy, the sanctification of obedience, had become the hidden religion of progress. So the Refusal fought differently. They began rewriting sermons, publishing essays under false names, embedding coded phrases in hymnals and devotionals. Phrases like, "The silent master sees," or "Bend the light, not the will." Ordinary readers never noticed. But to those initiated, these were signals, a reminder that submission was not faith, and that awakening must look like rebellion to those still asleep. One of the earliest members, Brother Nathaniel Cross, recorded this in a hidden journal found decades later in a Boston archive. We realized the curse of Elias was not vengeance. It was memory, passed from the broken to the awake. Every man who feels the quiet, unease beneath command carries it. Every soldier who hesitates before a cruel order. Every worker who looks up from his task and suddenly remembers he's more than the task. By the 1930s, the Refusal had grown into a shadow network, stretching from dock workers in New York to priests in Louisiana. They met under the guise of night prayer, reading from forbidden passages of scripture reinterpreted through Elias's teachings. They taught that evil doesn't always demand your worship. It asks only for your compliance. But the Dominion noticed. Reports from that era mention unrest in religious institutions, teachers dismissed for heresy, priests excommunicated for spiritual insubordination. Yet no one could trace the source. The Dominion Circle called them the Sons of Silence, because they spread ideas without a voice. Still, their influence reached high places. During the Second World War, psychological operations units began studying the same behavioral patterns the Dominion had pioneered: obedience, conditioning, trauma loops. But they also found records of anti-conditioning, methods of unlearning control. Those notes were marked with a symbol, a hand breaking a chain. The Refusal had infiltrated their systems from within. But their war wasn't fought with bullets, it was fought with awakening. And that's the war still happening, quietly, in every institution, every doctrine, every algorithm that tells you what to be. The Dominion learned to adapt. They realized if they couldn't stop the awakening, they could sell it back to you. When the Dominion realized the Refusal couldn't be erased, They did something far more sinister. They absorbed it. It started in the 1950s, during the age of revolutions. Rock and roll, youth rebellion, free love, counterculture. All movements that promised awakening, yet somehow led back into deeper control. What most people never saw was that every new form of freedom was quietly funded, studied, or guided by the same networks that once ran the obedience schools. The Dominion had evolved. They no longer needed chains, sermons, or plantations. They needed trends. They discovered something Elias had warned about a century earlier. That rebellion without clarity becomes the new obedience. So they created a world where men mistake indulgence for freedom, emotion for truth, and distraction for thought. Every decade, a new form of rebellion emerged, and every time it was absorbed, catalogued, and sold back as identity. Look closely at history. Every anti-system figure who rose to fame eventually became the system. Every ideology that promised liberation turned into another tool of control. That was no accident. The Dominion understood psychology had replaced theology. They didn't need faith. They needed dopamine. By the 1960s, their descendants were funding behavioral studies under new names: the Tavistock Institute, the Human Ecology Fund, MK Ultra. Programs that claimed to explore the mind's limits, but were, in truth, rediscovering the same principles written in the Whitmore journals. How to erase the will, how to shape identity through fear and illusion. But the refusal never died either. They adapted too. They saw what the Dominion was doing. How the system used pleasure to enslave, where pain once failed, so they encoded their resistance in new ways. Film, music, literature. You felt it before, haven't you? That strange chill when a line in a song feels too real. When a movie scene feels like it's speaking directly to something inside you. That's the signal of the refusal, buried like code, waiting to wake those who still feel. But the Dominion didn't panic. They only smiled, because they understood the deepest level of control is letting you rebel. As long as you do it inside their arena, you rage, you protest, you fight online. And yet, the algorithm decides what you see, what you feel, what you believe is freedom. That's the final perfection of the Whitmore philosophy. An empire where the slaves run the plantation themselves, convinced they are kings. Elias warned that once the Dominion reached that stage, the cycle would reset, and the next battle wouldn't be fought in fields, or churches, or schools. It would be fought in consciousness itself. They say the past is gone. But it isn't. It mutates. The Dominion learned that after centuries of fire and faith, men no longer feared chains or sermons. They feared irrelevance. The plantation became a platform. The overseer became an algorithm. The fields, now they're made of data. By the early 2000s, the old symbols began appearing again, quietly embedded in the architecture of the digital world. The serpent and the torch resurfaced in corporate logos, university seals, and even patent designs filed for neural mapping and behavioral modulation. Few noticed, but those who did disappeared into research positions or consulting roles within defense think tanks. What the Dominion discovered was elegant. The human mind could be farmed, not for labor, but for attention. Every click, every scroll, every thought anchored to a glowing screen became the new currency. You don't need chains when a man willingly hands over his time. And the irony, the very idea of waking up was built into the system itself. Hashtags, movements, influencers, all designed to simulate rebellion while keeping you inside the machine. The Dominion didn't silence the refusal, they copied it, commercialized it, turned awareness into entertainment. But something went wrong. Across encrypted forums and deep corners of the web, fragments of the original refusal texts began to appear. Scanned pages of ancient sermons, distorted audio files, documents written in the same code that once guided the Brotherhood. Phrases that made no sense to algorithms, but triggered something in the human mind. Lines like, "The eye cannot close once it learns to see itself." Those who read them began noticing strange things. Recommendations changing mid-sentence, devices glitching when they thought too hard about certain words. The system itself began pushing back, redirecting awareness toward distraction, toward consumption. You felt it. That invisible pull whenever you try to disconnect. That creeping unease when silence lasts too long. The Dominion doesn't need to watch you anymore. You watch yourself, and that's the final form of control. Not tyranny, not fear. Self-surveillance. But buried deep within the code, beneath the endless noise, there's still a signal. The same one that began in 1847 on that cursed plantation. The voice of Elias. No longer flesh, no longer ghost, whispering through the network. Refuse her still. Because once you realize the system's true nature, rebellion isn't a scream. It's a quiet act of clarity. The question is, when you finally hear that voice in your own mind, will you silence it or follow it? In every age, a few men notice the pattern. They see the invisible hand shaping thought, emotion, and belief, and something in them snaps awake. That's how the refusal returned. It didn't come back as a church or a movement. It came back as a pattern of awareness. Quiet forums, encrypted voice channels, hidden circles of men comparing notes about DAJ view in algorithms, impossible coincidences in their recommendations, strange recurring symbols that felt deliberate. Somewhere deep in that noise, a new document surfaced, the Whitmore fragment. A scanned page of handwriting too modern to be 19th century. Yet echoing the same phrases, it said, "Obedience has become choice. Control is now comfort. The only way out is through attention." They began testing it, groups of men disconnecting for 40 days. Tracking dreams, recording patterns in sleep and synchronicity. What they discovered wasn't mysticism, it was cognition. Once you withdraw attention from the machine, your mind starts to rebuild autonomy. The Dominion knows this, which is why silence has become the most punished act in the modern world. The refusal learned that clarity has a physical reaction in the system. The moment one man wakes, 1,000 distractions are triggered around him. Social drama, political outrage, constant novelty. Anything to fragment focus. But those who held their line began to see through it. They described the same vision, a network not of data, but of conscious observers, each awakening strengthening the next. A field of awareness that cannot be owned, monetized, or predicted. In their encrypted discussions, they started to use a new term, the Unseen Republic. Not a nation, not a creed, a state of perception free from manipulation. The Dominion monitors every word, so the refusal hides in plain sight, inside art, language, and silence itself. Every symbol you see now, the eye, the serpent, the chain, has two meanings. One enslaves, the other awakens. Elias's final warning echoes through every fragment they decode. One man becomes his own overseer, he must also become his own liberator. And that's where you stand now, between comfort and clarity, between being watched and seeing. Every time you look away from the screen, the system weakens. Every time you question, a piece of it collapses. The algorithm doesn't fear rebellion. It fears awareness. The first confrontation between the Unseen Republic and the Dominion didn't happen in the streets. It happened in silence. In 2011, a small group of researchers, data scientists, ex-chaplains, and veterans, met in a disused monastery on the outskirts of Maryland. No phones. No Wi-Fi. They had found each other by tracing a string of coded citations buried in obscure academic papers, each referencing an Elias variable in behavioral studies. None of them had ever heard of the Whitmores. Yet each felt the same tug, that pattern of awareness that the refusal described. They called their gathering the first vigil. For 3 days they sat without speaking, reading nothing but fragments of the Whitmore Codex and notes from early Dominion experiments. What emerged was not a manifesto, but a map how attention loops were engineered, how digital triggers hijacked instinct, how free will was nudged by imperceptible cues. One of them, an aging psychologist named Dr. Avery, wrote in his notebook, "We are no longer chained by masters. We are chained by mirrors. The plantation is a screen." They understood then that the Dominion had achieved its greatest coup, turning the ancient ritual of obedience into a user experience. People curate their own cages now. They wear their chains like preferences. But the vigil also discovered something else. There is a moment, tiny, measurable, when a man's attention becomes truly his own. In that instant, suggestions fail, algorithms misfire, propaganda slides off like rain. It's the digital equivalent of Elias standing in the cane field and saying, "No." That moment of self-directed attention is contagious. One man focusing clearly can cause another to feel it without speaking a word. The vigil called it the spark. They began training themselves to hold it longer. And for the first time in generations, the Dominion systems started to glitch. Not from hacking, but from presence. Shortly after the vigil ended, its members began receiving offers, speaking gigs, grants, think tank positions, soft bribes to bring them back inside. Some accepted, some vanished. A few refused and disappeared into the noise. But the signal they found is still moving, hidden in plain sight. Every time you feel the pull to step back from the feed, to think before you react, to breathe before you obey. That's the spark. It's not a slogan. It's not a movement. It's a state. The unseen republic isn't out there somewhere. It begins in you. They called it the discipline of the hidden eye. It was never written down, never preached, never sold. It was taught in silence, one man to another, like fire being passed from a single ember in the dark. The unseen republic understood what Elias had begun. They knew the Dominion's power wasn't in weapons or armies. It was in attention, the modern currency of obedience. Whoever controls where men look controls how men think, and whoever commands how men think rules the unseen world. So they built practices not for rebellion, but for retreat. Men learned to withdraw from the noise, to see their thoughts like shadows on water, reflections, not truths. They learned to separate impulse from intention, reaction from awareness, emotion from direction. A man trained in the hidden eye could walk through propaganda and feel nothing. He could watch deception unfold and remain unshaken. He didn't fight the current. He stepped out of the river entirely. That was the first law. He who watches himself cannot be owned. When you watch yourself, truly, without distortion, you become something the Dominion cannot calculate. Their systems thrive on predictability, but a self-aware man is unpredictable. He breaks pattern. He bends algorithms. He sees the trick as it's happening. That's why every structure in the modern world is built to scatter your attention, to keep you divided from yourself. They fear stillness because in stillness you see, and once you see, you choose. The Republic believed the second law was even more dangerous. Choice is the first act of sovereignty. Every time a man chooses silence over noise, truth over comfort, awareness over indulgence, he commits a quiet act of rebellion. No slogan, no army, just control of himself. And when thousands of men began doing this, quietly, invisibly, globally, the Dominion's predictive models began to fail. The machine grew erratic. It started misreading human behavior. They called it the shadow glitch, a spreading anomaly that no one could trace, where human will defied all probability. The Dominion was afraid, not of war, not of exposure, but of men waking up, because the moment you awaken, their power ends. History, as you were taught it, isn't a record. It's a weapon. Every empire, every government, every institution that rose after the Dominion understood the same unspoken law. If you can't kill an idea, bury it under 1,000 lies. And so they buried the unseen republic. Their names were erased from archives, their writings misattributed, their symbols inverted. The serpent became evil instead of wisdom. The eye became surveillance instead of awareness. Even the word freedom was rewritten to mean indulgence, not discipline. This is how the Dominion wins, not by force, but by substitution. They rewrite the language until men can no longer describe their own imprisonment. And once the words are gone, the mind follows. The Republic's texts were scattered, pieces hidden in religious manuscripts, hermetic scrolls, and later in the occult revivals of the 19th century. But each time the message resurfaced, it was quickly absorbed by a new order: the church, the state, the market, the media. The same pattern, wearing different masks. The Dominion perfected what they called narrative laundering, the art of turning resistance into entertainment, truth into myth, and awakening into conspiracy. That way, the few who still searched for the truth would find it mocked, diluted, or commodified. The seeker would become the fool. But a few fragments survived untouched, carried in secret lineages, encoded in paintings, whispered in Masonic lodges, and later, buried inside the philosophy of men like Jung, Nietzsche, and Blake, men who stared into the unconscious and came back with fragments of something older than language itself. And in every era, one line keeps returning like an echo through time: they will teach you to forget what you already know. That is the essence of control. Not to imprison your body, but to convince you that you were never free. Yet the Dominion made one fatal miscalculation. The human soul has memory older than history, and when one man reclaims even a piece of that memory, truly remembers himself, it calls others to do the same. That's why you're here, not by accident. You were pulled to this because something inside you remembered the pattern. Reason, progress, civilization. They dress themselves in these words like silk robes, but underneath it's the same old machinery. Manipulation, obedience, extraction. The Dominion learned that brute force makes martyrs, but reason makes slaves. When you convince a man he is too intelligent to question the system, you no longer have to chain him. He will chain himself, proudly. Universities became the new pulpits. Institutions of science became temples of consensus. Every study funded, every chair endowed, every think tank seeded. All built to shape not knowledge but perception. You are not taught how to think. You are taught how to signal thinking. And in the act of signaling, you surrender the act itself. The Dominion's genius was to hide inside the very thing that was supposed to free men. Rationality. When faith lost its hold, they used data. When kings lost their hold, they used democracy. When nations lost their hold, they used globalization. Layer upon layer of benevolence, each mask softer than the one before, until the world looked free. And no one noticed the invisible leash tightening around their mind. The Dominion calls this the velvet cage, and men decorated themselves. Their jobs, their screens, their schedules, their obligations, all painted as choice. But the unseen republic had warned of this long ago. He who cannot be deceived by cruelty will be deceived by comfort. You can see it now in real time. Every news cycle engineered to exhaust. Every product engineered to seduce. Every institution engineered to pacify. A civilization built on keeping you distracted while convincing you you're enlightened. Yet there is an opening, because the velvet cage depends on your agreement. It cannot exist without your attention, and every man who withdraws even a fragment of that attention begins to see the bars for what they are. Invisible, yes, but brittle. The Dominion fears this above all. A man who refuses to be dazzled by progress and reason is a man they cannot chart, cannot sedate, cannot predict. He becomes, once again, what Elias was, a sovereign, a signal glitch. You were told slavery ended, but that was just good marketing. Chains became contracts, whips became deadlines, and the plantation, it became the modern world. Sterile, digitized, disguised as opportunity. The Dominion learned that true captivity isn't physical, it's psychological. If you can convince a man to seek his own servitude, he'll never realize he's enslaved. He'll call it ambition. He'll call it success. The old masters demanded obedience through fear. The new ones do it through desire. They make you crave the cage, the validation, the status, the comfort of being productive. You wear exhaustion like a badge. You worship efficiency like a god. And in the process, you become exactly what the system needs: predictable, dependent, and distracted. Look closely at the architecture of your daily life. The routine, the schooling, the endless cycles of reward and punishment. Do you see it? The patterns are ancient. Every bell in a classroom, every quarterly review, every dopamine hit from your screen, all calibrated to keep you in rhythm with the machine. The Dominion calls it the harvest. They no longer take crops or labor. They take attention, energy, time. They harvest consciousness. The only resource that ever truly mattered. The unseen republic warned that this would come. They called it the Great Return to the Plantation, when men would beg for comfort over freedom and call their compliance morality. But there's something they didn't expect. Somewhere deep within every man, in the marrow of his defiance, there's a remnant of the primal spark that cannot be owned. That's why they drown you in distraction, fear, and pleasure. Because if you ever stop, even for one breath, that spark wakes up, and when it does, you begin to see what's been done to you. Elias called it the awakening of the unseen eye. The moment when a man realizes that everything he obeys, from his job to his faith to his own thoughts, might not be his at all. That realization is dangerous. Because once you see the system for what it is, you can never unsee it again. It begins in silence, not with riots, not with revolutions, not with slogans, just silence. A man sits in a room one night, phone face down, screen dark, no sound. He notices his hands tremble as the impulses die down. He notices how badly his body wants to check the feed, the news, the noise. And then, for the first time, he resists. 10 seconds, 20, a minute. The hunger claws at him, but something else begins to stir. A clarity he hasn't felt in years. This is how it starts. Awakening is not a battle against others. It's a battle against the reflexes they built inside you. Every time you break the pattern, even once, you loosen the Dominion's grip on your nervous system. Men who practice this begin to change. They no longer respond to the same bait, the same outrage, the same seductions. The Dominion's algorithms misfire. Their psychological hooks slip. The systems built on prediction falter, because prediction requires repetition. And these men stop repeating. They don't shout about it. They don't post about it. They don't brand it. They just live it. The Unseen Republic called this breaking the loop, a small act, invisible from the outside, but internally seismic. Once a man knows the taste of self-command, everything else feels counterfeit. Status, indulgence, distraction, all exposed as toys. And here's what terrifies the Dominion. This awakening spreads wordlessly. One man's presence awakens another. One man's stillness unsettles a room. One man's refusal to react destabilizes an entire social script. It's like an infection of sovereignty. When enough men do this, the plantation model collapses. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, total withdrawal of consent. The Dominion's greatest fear isn't exposure, it's irrelevance. The spark that Elias carried across centuries is igniting now in this age of noise. It does not look like war. It does not look like politics. It looks like men turning their eyes inward, taking back the throne of their own minds. And once you sit on that throne, truly sit, no master can summon you, no leash can hold you. You are off the grid in the only way that matters. Right now, you're not just watching a video, you're standing at a threshold. Everything you've heard so far isn't just a story about a slave, or a family, or a hidden network. It's a mirror held up to you, to your habits, to your life, to the invisible plantation built around your mind. Up until this point, you've been listening. But this next step is an act, a declaration. The Unseen Republic always had a moment like this in their initiations. A small, symbolic gesture to anchor the shift inside the mind. It wasn't magic. It was memory. A way of saying, I see the pattern, and from this moment, I refuse. We can't pass embers hand to hand the way they did, but we can still do it here. Right now. In a moment, I'll ask you to type a phrase. Not because it's a gimmick. Not because it's a hashtag. But because it's an anchor. A way to speak your refusal into the digital noise, to plant your flag in the algorithm itself. Here's the phrase, I will not be harvested. If this message has stirred something in you, if you felt even a flicker of the spark that Elias carried, the spark of the Unseen Republic, then type those words below twice. Type them once to declare it to yourself. Type them a second time to echo it into the code that's watching, measuring, predicting you. It may look like a simple comment, but comments feed the system. Every time you post, you teach the algorithm what to amplify. When enough men anchor the same phrase, the very machine that was built to contain you begins spreading the signal instead. That's how a whisper becomes a current. That's how a current becomes a tide. That's how men escape the velvet cage. So pause. Breathe. And if you're ready, write it now. Write, I will not be harvested. I will not be harvested. It's the digital version of stepping off the plantation. A small, quiet act of sovereignty. Something strange happens when enough men act in unison. The very code designed to track and shape you begins to misfire. The Dominion built the mirror net to measure, predict, and nudge. But it can only measure what it already understands. It was never built to handle true independence, true unpredictability. When thousands of men post the same phrase, not as a trend but as a vow, the machine registers it as signal, not noise. It pushes it higher, amplifies it, thinking it's just another viral hook. But it isn't. It's a seed of awakening traveling inside the bloodstream of the system. This is why the Unseen Republic worked in symbols and oaths instead of campaigns. They knew that conscious acts inside unconscious systems create rips in the pattern. The algorithm becomes an accidental courier for its own undoing. And then something even deeper occurs. The men who wrote, I will not be harvested, aren't just commenting, they're anchoring. Every time they see their own words, They're reminded of the spark. Every time someone new encounters it, the spark jumps to them. Awareness isn't taught. It's caught. The Dominion's models depend on your forgetfulness, on your constant scrolling, reacting, consuming. But a single repeated phrase acts like a psychic nail, pinning awareness to the wall of your mind. It can't be scrolled away. It can't be recommended into oblivion. This is the beginning of what Elias foresaw. Not rebellion as noise, but rebellion as signal, quiet, precise, viral. A network of men reclaiming themselves one by one, until the plantation dissolves from the inside. The old systems are already cracking. Institutions are losing trust. Narratives are fracturing. Even the Dominion can feel it. That's why distraction is at an all-time high. Why the noise is deafening. Because something is waking under it, and that something is you. A man who remembers he was never meant to be harvested. This is the true forbidden knowledge. The moment you stop playing the game begins to collapse. When awareness spreads faster than control, the Dominion initiates what they call the last veil. This is their endgame. Not war, not lockdowns, not even censorship. It's assimilation. They've learned from centuries of failure that open repression breeds martyrs, and martyrs breed memory. So when a population begins to wake up, they don't crush it. They absorb it. They offer you a softer cage, a sheenier leash, a movement you can join that looks like rebellion but runs on their servers. You've seen this before. Outrage turned into entertainment. Resistance turned into merchandise. Ancient symbols repackaged as corporate logos. This is the last veil. They hand you a rebellion that feels righteous, but is secretly scripted. They'll invite you to shout, to march, to post, to exhaust yourself on causes they control, while the true machinery remains untouched. Every leader amplified, every solution offered, every algorithm tuned to steer you into a new identity, a new cycle of obedience. It's their most brilliant trick. You believe you've escaped, but you're still inside the labyrinth, just in a different chamber. The Unseen Republic had a name for this. The Master's Rebellion, a revolt gifted to you by the same hand that built your chains. And yet, even this has a flaw. The last veil only works if you move outward, if you're chasing, reacting, projecting. It cannot touch the man who moves inward, who builds his sovereignty in silence, discipline, and clarity. He doesn't need slogans. He doesn't need saviors. He doesn't need to perform his defiance. He simply becomes ungovernable from within. That's what Elias meant when he said, "The only true escape is self-possession." Once you have that, the last veil collapses. The Dominion can no longer offer you a rebellion, because you no longer need one. You've already left the plantation in the only way that matters. And in that moment, you're no longer a follower. You're a node, a living, breathing break in the pattern. Listen closely now, because this is where it ends. The Dominion will tell you you're small, that the system is too vast, too complex, too inevitable. That your awareness is a whisper against the thunder of the machine, but they're wrong. Because systems die when the men inside them wake up. Elias knew it. The Unseen Republic lived it. And now, across continents, across screens, across time, it's happening again. Every man who has felt that flicker of disgust with the lies, he's fed. Every man who stopped scrolling and felt the hollow echo of his own thoughts returning to him. Every man who's seen the pattern and whispered, "I will not be harvested." You are the continuation of that forbidden lineage. This isn't mythology. It's memory, buried deep in your blood. There's something older than obedience, older than fear, older than the Dominion itself. It's the memory of self-rule, of the ancient covenant between a man and his own consciousness. That is what they've spent centuries trying to erase. Not your freedom, but your remembrance of it. And now, that remembrance is rising again, quietly, relentlessly, through men who refuse to be entertained into extinction, men who choose stillness over noise, men who reclaim their minds, one choice at a time. You may feel alone, but you are not. You are part of a network that cannot be tracked, because it lives in awareness, not code. It doesn't need leaders, banners, or approval. It only needs men who can see. So remember what you've heard here, because you were never meant to hear it. Remember Elias. Remember the unseen republic. Remember that no master can own a man who knows himself. And, when the world tries to drown you in distraction again, whisper the words that pierce through every layer of their illusion. I will not be harvested. I say it until it's no longer defiance, but identity. Because that's how the dominion falls, not with noise, not with war, but with men who wake up, look back at the cage, and simply walk away.